So my paper analyzes economic provision or acquisition of wealth, or al-kasb in Islamic tradition, primarily through maṣlaḥa and adab as ethical concepts. In this paper, I explore maṣlaḥa's relation to the ethos of adab as extension of Sharia's moral law and other equally important yet neglected conceptualizations that complement ethically driven economic engagements, often expressed through the stations of maqāmāt that include the concepts of wara, zuhd, and faqr. One of the main premises is not to show that Sufi literature provides all the answers to various economic predicaments in Islamic tradition. Far from it. After all, many scholars were not Sufis themselves, but only resorted to particular Sufi conceptualizations, but rather that adab is closely associated with maṣlaḥa and complements, in my opinion, the study of economic history by offering vistas for analyzing economic engagements as part of cultivating the inner self and maintaining virtuous character. So I would concentrate on the understanding of kasb in economic affairs and take conceptually and critically about maṣlaḥa as an ethical category that corresponds with adab's more holistic vision of human nature when invoking the notions of economic provision and welfare. The main question that I try to provide answer to is what constitutes economic provision in classical Islamic thought and upon which methods, concepts, and predisposition it is founded. First, I will briefly address the theoretical considerations of Maqāṣid and Maṣlaḥa as reflected in the writings of Abu Hamid al-Ghazali. Following that, I analyze certain classical Muslim scholars who wrote on kasb, such as al-Shaybani, al-Muhasibi, Ibn Abi al-Dunya, al-Mawardi, and again, al-Ghazali. I argue that Islamic scholarship had a different understanding of economics from the classical economic science that was invoked through kasb or al-iqtisad and their ethical dimensions. So acquiring or dealing with wealth was neither a technical manner nor a legal obligation, but primarily a moral engagement that harkens to the technology of self-examination. Such a vision of the moral self and economic development was inextricably related to the spiritual qualities of iqtisad and thus aimed at securing the well-being of an individual and community. As a theologian and adherent of tasawwuf, and in essence, I would argue an ethicist, al-Ghazali elaborated on the maqāṣid in the context of, as we already know, safeguarding the 5 categories of deen, nafs, aql, nasl, and mal. The very idea of preservation of these 5 categories explicates not only legal, but also ethical concerns, for the former are subsumed by the latter. The claim that maqāṣid entails the gist of Sharia law presupposes that it deals with ethical aspects of legal norms, whereby ideas of justice and social welfare are contextualized as metaphysical axioms. So the preservation of 5 categories, including the preservation of wealth, or hifd al-mal, hence takes into consideration economic and commercial activities such as allocation of wealth, circulation of money, and intentions behind one's action, which are viewed as ethically driven endeavors. Given that the concept of maṣlaḥa has remained primarily in the backdrop of Islamic legal discourse, it was rarely discussed in the context of cosmological and metaphysical qualities of economic thought. Barter exchange, property rights, acquisition of wealth, and other economic mechanisms employ both material or worldly and non-material or spiritual reading and are part and parcel of the Quranic metaphysical system that undergirds large parts of Islamic intellectual tradition. More specifically, for al-Ghazali, maṣlaḥa as an integral part of maqāṣid means observing and fulfilling objectives of the lawgiver, which are moral in essence. In his encyclopedic Ihya Ulumuddin, he clearly states that fiqh is an ethical category, and that was with time made to refer only to the technical side of the law. So al-Ghazali informs us that fiqh, quote, has become a specialized branch of fatwas and waqfs on small details about them and excessive debate surrounding them. The meaning of fiqh in the first period was, however, undisputably linked to the science of the path of the hereafter, right? Knowledge of the details of harmful matters of the self and that which corrupts human action, understanding of indulging the wickedness of the world, perseverance for reaching the grace of the hereafter, and God's fears domination over the heart, end of quote. So in more economic terms, Al-Ghazali asserts that the value of human labor does not rest on the idea of gaining profit, whereas the production of basic necessities for the public good is perceived as a social and individual obligation, or fard kifaya. It is hence safe to say that all economic conduct is seen in light of benefit and this utility, masalih or mafāṣid, permeated by the moral law. This presupposes that economic and commercial activities are part of the higher objectives of Sharia, whereby one tries to increase maslaha instead of utility in a conventional sense. Al-Shaybani, Al-Muhasibi, Ibn Abi al-Dunya, Al-Tusi, Al-Mawardi, Al-Isfahani, in addition to Al-Ghazali, all wrote on kasb and zuhd in light of the benefit they possess. While not all scholars belong to the tradition of tasawwuf or refer to maslaha directly, they examine the notion of well-being or social benefit when theorizing economic behaviors. Those legal scholars and theologians address, broadly speaking, economic ideas in ethical terms, often embedded in the ethos of adab as an articulation of virtuous traits of character. Second, in addition to maṣlaḥa, the stations of maqāmāt as an embodiment of both mystical knowledge and Islamic law through the moral reconfiguration of the human soul can be reconsidered within the context of preserving welfare when discussing economic predicaments. And in the following pages, I showcase some of those scholars and then their economic philosophy. So while the term adab etymologically relates to dab as custom or habit and carries both ethical and practical meaning as high quality of soul or even urbanity or courtesy, after the 7th century, it acquired also an intellectual meaning as the sum of knowledge that makes one courteous. In the classical period, adab carried polyvalent, multiple functions, some of which designated as a social education, traditional mannerism, shaping of character, or even literature. Today, it is closely associated with akhlaq or ethics, yet akhlaq became prevalent in the modern period, in part also due to the rise of political Islam and its more Puritan interpretations. The term adab and its derivatives demonstrate an understanding of integrative moral education pertaining to good character and nobility. So the outward actions are thus bound to inner certitudes. In other words, in the context of adab, one's daily economic activities, including purchases, sales, participation in barter exchange, and dealing with wealth in general, mirrors one's inner predisposition, moral behavior, as well as social responsibilities. Maqāmāt can be in this light obtained through a rigorous spiritual exercise and devotion through daily activities as an aspect of one's religious life. This relationality further provides an insight into the correlation between earning or acquiring wealth, kasb, and extramundane detachment or zuhd. One, however, purifies one's heart also by purifying one's wealth through engaging in fair economic activities such as providing for one's family and paying zakat. So zuhd does not mean rejecting the world as it has been often interpreted, but rather inner worldly asceticism. Al-Qurayshi famously said that renunciation is to give up both the dinar and the dirham, right? The golden dinar and the silver dirham. Such an attitude does not convey that wealth is a sin or that profit is illicit, but rather that one has to constantly re-examine one's own attachment to the material world and economic matters. It was, however, Al-Shaybani's Kitab al-Kasb among the first to study not only legal, but also more traditional and ethical themes of economic engagement, arguably merging legal precepts of Sharia with moral reverberations of wealth and poverty. For Al-Shaybani, kasb as individual and collective activity has to be considered for the public good, or maṣlaḥa. Al-Shaybani holds that kasb contributes towards common good since one can provide first for one's own family and second for the community. Kasb then pertains to basic needs and necessities such as food, clothing, and shelter. Al-Muhasibi, who was a Shafi jurist and a Sufi whose intellectual influence can also be found in Al-Ghazali, believed that when engaged in economic activities and earning a living, one should also exercise mindfulness, remembrance, or dhikr, closeness to God, al-taqarrub, and purifying one's heart, taharat al-qulub. By navigating the worldly life, one has to balance then between miserliness and expenditure in preserving one's dignity. In his Kitab Ta'dib al-Murid, he further describes an educational scheme, Ta'dib, on how to govern oneself throughout the day, including economic postulates, indicating that kasb is to be obtained first and foremost by one's fair earnings. Ibn Abi al-Dunya perceived wealth as both belonging to the material and the moral realm, while addressing spiritual qualities of economic behavior. He analyzes beneficial functions of money as a divine generosity. Charity, for instance, has to be given by everyone who possesses money. However, saving money is a virtue on its own right because it can benefit others, while unnecessary spending might bring upon harm. Al-Mawardi's Adab al-Dunya wal-Deen deals not only with Islamic law and tradition, but also with the cultivation of personal virtues or adab. Social inequalities, Al-Mawardi informs us, are a natural progression. However, they can be advantageous only if there is a cooperation between different groups of people and industries, whereas the governmental authority is required to guarantee an equitable distribution of income. To create a welfare society, the governmental authority then regulates and manages public finances, revenues, levies zakat, and provides benefits to the members of the community from the treasury. Adab as a moral education is for Mawardi the discipline of body, mind, and soul associated with cultivating economic awareness in terms of securing just conduct in markets, minimizing harm when engaging with barter exchange, and providing food for community. The pinnacle of the ethical economic genre, how I'll call it, in Islamic tradition is, however, Al-Ghazali, who provided a detailed account on economic engagements by combining both, I would argue, philosophical reasoning and Sufi conceptualizations in the context of his theory of eternal happiness, or Sa'ada. Now, Sa'ada permeates his theological, legal, and Sufi thought, and it encompasses also the very concept of Maṣlaḥa as benefit. He often referenced other Sufi scholars, including al-Muhasibi and al-Isfahani, when discussing economic ideas. Al-Ghazali's economic thought, which is primarily found in the third book of the second volume of Ihya, titled Kitab Adab al-Kasb wal-Ma'ash, and is centered on his theory of the science of the hereafter, Ilm Tariq al-Akhirah, is part of his overall ethical system or moral epistemology, aiming at reviving the lost religious sciences of the day. Economic activities, which one is expected to perform on a daily basis, form an important part of that system. Al-Ghazali asserts that poverty means being independent from worldly desires, while at the same time maintaining a healthy engagement with the phenomenal world. He upholds that ihsan has to be practiced in the market as an act of generosity, and cautions that one should take only that much of goods from this world as it is absolutely necessary for one's life. Likewise, the level of consumption has to then be balanced between necessity and extravagance. Since the ultimate goal of trade and commerce is for Al-Ghazali not in gaining profits for the sake of making money, but the remembrance of the hereafter, one's engagement has to be beneficial for the wider community. While money has been created in order to fulfill basic human needs, one should seek balance when dealing with it and avoid miserliness. And miserliness is defined as excessive restriction on expenditure and extravagance, which is excessive spending of wealth. So since having wealth also opened doors for possible enjoyment of illicit pleasures, he constantly draws attention to the fact that money does not possess an intrinsic value, but rather that its value lies in that it facilitates exchange of commodities. Adab as the inner disposition of the soul and the practice of self-examination geared towards spiritual closeness to the divine is hence part of his science of the unveiling, or ilm al-mukashaf. It encompasses voluntary acts as virtuous traits of character, and is neither a term reserved specifically for the tradition of tasawwuf, nor is it disassociated from Sharia's law, but rather subsumed with one's moral compass. The theoretical consideration of adab as a moral formulation correlates to praxis of renouncing excessive economic gains within the context of the purification of the heart, and is often invoked together with maslaha as benefit. Al-Ghazali cautions that spiritual guidance based on adab is ultimately about taqwa, an inward consciousness of the divine that brings about poised character. In conclusion, mechanisms such as charity, sadaqah, alms tax, zakat, and institutions such as charitable trust funds or waqf and supervision of markets, hizbah, were in the classical period not only conceived within the legal realm of Maqās al-Sharīʿa, the preservation of the common good or maṣlaḥa, and policy-oriented governance or siyasa shari'iyya, but were also conceived through the concept of adab as moral mannerism and personal strivings to attain the divine. In light of such understanding, ethical concerns formed the gist of economic thought. Questions on economic justice or adl, prohibition of usury, riba, just governance, ahkam al-sultaniyya, and well-being were by classical scholars discussed in legal texts, theological works, and Sufi treatises. These scholars believed that implementing the concept of justice was crucial for providing welfare to community that was not only a matter of legal injunction or political decision, but rather a moral issue embedded in how one performs and cultivates righteous character. So acquiring wealth, redistribution of goods, participating in trade, and supervising market regulations were, by the aforementioned scholars, conceived in relation to commercials law, mu'amalat, that were, however, studied not only as legal injunctions, but also as ethical categories complementing acts of worship or ibadat. From this vantage point, it is viable to view ethical economic genre in Islamic tradition not simply as an amalgamation of legal and economic obligations, but rather as a specific contribution within that tradition whereby personal traits and virtuous behavior are constantly foregrounded in the notion of common good through the intricacy of moral principles. Thank you so much for your attention, and I look forward to the discussion.